It begins with a tremble in the gut, a tightening in the chest, the kind of fear that doesn't come from a wild animal charging through the forest, but from something far less visible, yet far more relentless: anxiety. It is one of the oldest emotions known to humankind, yet today it stalks us differently. Not as a fleeting survival instinct, but as a daily companion, a shadow that never leaves, growing longer as the day progresses. A silent scream that echoes through boardrooms, bedrooms, and classrooms, following millions through every waking moment. The human brain, once finely tuned to spot predators in tall grass, now perceives threats in email notifications, social media posts, and looming deadlines. But where did this modern epidemic truly begin? And more disturbingly, are contemporary humans actually equipped to survive this invisible onslaught? Or are we witnessing the slow unraveling of minds never designed to bear such relentless psychological weight? The roots of anxiety trace back to the dawn of consciousness itself, buried deep in our evolutionary past. In the unforgiving Pleistocene wilderness, early humans who scanned the horizon a moment longer, who flinched at the rustle in the grass, who felt that primal surge of fear at the slightest shadow, were the ones who lived to see another sunrise. Their vigilance wasn't weakness, it was evolution's masterpiece, a sophisticated survival mechanism honed through thousands of generations. The anxious survived while the carefree perished. Their brains adapted to constant risk, threading a fragile balance between life-saving alertness and debilitating paranoia. This primal wiring never disappeared from our neurological architecture. It was passed down through countless generations, silently encoded like a survival ghost in our DNA, an invisible inheritance we never asked for but cannot refuse. Back then, anxiety arrived with sharp edges and clear purposes, real consequences, life or death immediacy, a lurking predator with gleaming eyes, a devastating famine that emptied food stores, a violent sky promising destruction. The threat appeared, the body responded, then relief came with survival. Today, that same ancient system is still firing, the same neurochemical cascade floods our bodies, but now the danger is abstract, ambiguous, and most disturbingly, unrelenting. The threats are digital notifications that never stop, economic uncertainties that hover like specters, existential questions that find no answers. The same ancient alarm bells ring in our amygdala, triggering cortisol and adrenaline to course through our veins, but no one shows up to put out the fire. So what happens to the human mind when the emergency never ends, when our ancestral warning system never finds resolution? What occurs in the body perpetually prepared for a disaster that takes new forms but never fully materializes or concludes? As civilization advanced, the world grew safer, yet the human mind remained haunted by threats both real and imagined. The rise of agriculture offered temporary stability, but it came at a psychological cost that few recognize even today. Sedentary life forged tightly knit communities where comparison, reputation, and social survival gained unprecedented weight. Anxiety evolved once more, insidiously transforming. It no longer signaled the rustling of predators in a forest, but manifested in the silent judgment of a neighboring glance, the whispers behind closed doors, the fear of exclusion from the group that meant survival. Religious fears took root in these communities, gods who demanded perfection and threatened eternal suffering. Social taboos created invisible boundaries, where transgression meant ostracism. The pressure of conformity crushed individuality under its weight. In ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets preserving desperate prayers, begging gods to lift the burden of restlessness, describing symptoms hauntingly familiar to modern panic attacks. In ancient China, physicians documented disorders where the heart and mind remained constantly unsettled, prescribing herbs and practices to calm what they called the agitated spirit. Across every continent, from Egyptian papyri to Ayurvedic texts, early medical systems attempted to describe what healers could observe in their patients, but not physically see. A storm beneath the skin that made strong men tremble and wise women doubt. Anxiety began to take shape not just as emotion, but as cultural malaise, an invisible invader that shaped how entire civilizations worshipped, governed, and sought meaning. Shamans performed rituals to cast out these unseen tormentors, while philosophers debated whether such suffering was the price of consciousness itself. Yet something even more transformative loomed on the horizon, a shift so profound it would fundamentally alter the human experience, something that wouldn't just prolong anxiety, but give it a worldwide stage and endless fuel, forever changing how we experience our own minds. The Industrial Revolution did not just mechanize factories, it rewired our internal worlds with violent efficiency. For the first time in human history, the sacred rhythm of life was no longer dictated by the gentle rising of the sun or the patient turning of seasons, but by the shrill screams of factory whistles, the relentless ticking of time clocks, and the crushing weight of production deadlines. Cities transformed into psychological pressure chambers where soot blackened not just buildings but souls. Desperate rural migrants flooded these concrete jungles, exchanging the healing embrace of natural landscapes for a cacophony of mechanical noise, industrial filth, and the crushing weight of anonymity among strangers. Work itself underwent a sinister transformation, becoming less physically demanding, yet infinitely more psychologically taxing. The body remained sedentary, chained to machines or desks, while the mind raced frantically through labyrinths of abstract problems with no tangible resolution. A profound alienation bloomed in the sickly yellow glow of gas lamps and beneath towering smokestacks that blocked out the sky. Children who once would have known every neighbor now walked past hundreds of strangers daily, their developing brains bombarded with more unfamiliar faces in a week than their ancestors might have encountered in a lifetime. In these mechanized societies, anxiety found fertile ground for new, more insidious disguises. The factory worker stood trapped in soul-crushing repetition without purpose or end, hands performing mechanical motions while the spirit withered. The office clerk drowned in bureaucratic paperwork, buried alive under meaningless forms and records. The mother struggled to maintain collapsing family traditions while raising frightened children in unfamiliar, claustrophobic quarters where sunlight barely penetrated. Medical journals of the 19th century began chronicling a mysterious affliction they called neurasthenia, a clinical diagnosis of exhausted nerves caused, they claimed, by the relentless speed and unnatural stimulation of modern life. Patients reported feeling constantly overwhelmed, their internal resources depleted by an environment humans never evolved to inhabit. Prominent thinkers and physicians of the era feared civilization itself was devouring the human spirit, consuming the very essence of what made us whole. And perhaps they glimpsed a terrible truth. This transformation represented not just another chapter in anxiety's ancient story, but its catastrophic amplification and mutation. It served as a warning signal that the very systems humans designed to improve life might instead be systematically eroding the mental foundations we didn't even recognize were keeping us whole. The machine age had arrived, and with it, the mechanization of human distress on an unprecedented scale. Then came the digital age, a revolution invisible to the naked eye but devastating in psychological reach. It promised liberation, connection, infinite information at our fingertips. Yet what it delivered instead was an unrelenting onslaught of stimuli. The human brain was never built to process. With every glowing screen came another portal to a world where danger was not physical but existential. The blue light of smartphones penetrated our darkest nights, disrupting melatonin production while their content disrupted our deepest peace. Social media platforms meticulously transformed ancient fears of exclusion into algorithmically amplified nightmares, customizing our insecurities with surgical precision and broadcasting them back to us in endless scrolls that left us hollow yet craving more. Each notification hijacked our fight-or-flight systems, sending micro-jolts of adrenaline with every ping, training our nervous systems to exist in perpetual low-grade emergency. The sacred boundaries between work and rest disintegrated entirely, replaced by an expectation of 24/7 availability, disguised under the cruel illusion of digital freedom. In bedrooms and living spaces lit constantly by the ghostly LED glow, sleep cycles shattered into fragments, attention splintered into microsecond bursts, and anxiety metastasized into a chronic condition, wearing the mask of normal modern life. Psychiatric diagnoses associated with anxiety tripled, then quadrupled, then became so common they barely registered as remarkable. Children born into this reality, never knew the silence of an uninterrupted thought, the comfort of undivided attention, or the security of privacy. Teenagers grew up in a psychological coliseum where their worth was measured in reactions and shares, where their performance and identity were endlessly monitored, quantified, and monetized by invisible algorithms designed not for their well-being, but for corporate profit. The surveillance of the soul became normalized, with each keystroke and search query feeding massive data engines that knew our desires before we recognized them ourselves. Clinical anxiety transformed from disorder to default setting, not just common but expected. The inevitable symptom of being alive in a world spinning faster than the human mind can possibly integrate or comprehend. Yet even as pharmaceutical companies mass-marketed chemical relief in colorful capsules and medical systems strained under the weight of psychic suffering, the core question remains suffocatingly unanswered. What happens when an ancient emotional mechanism, evolved for survival in tribal plains and forest edges, finds itself trapped in a digital hurricane of artificial threats, false urgency, and relentless comparison? If anxiety once kept our ancestors alive beneath starlit skies, what does it mean now that it keeps us awake, isolated, and drowning in invisible fears beneath the artificial stars of our device screens? The terrifying irony grips us with cold fingers. In the age of ultimate technological progress, we may be more psychologically unwell than at any previous point in human history. Anxiety has not only endured through human evolution, it has conquered the very species that carries it, becoming the silent pandemic that speaks through racing hearts and sleepless nights. But perhaps the most haunting question is not how anxiety evolved, but whether we have the courage to confront what it reveals about our deepest selves. Beneath the cacophony of notifications and the crushing weight of societal expectations lies a profound disquiet, a spiritual vacancy that expands like a black hole in an era that worships productivity over presence, acceleration over stillness, and curated visibility over raw authenticity. We desperately anesthetize the symptoms with pharmaceutical solutions, mindfulness apps, breathing exercises, and periodic digital detoxes, but rarely do we interrogate the oppressive structures causing the illness at its core. Such confrontation would require untangling the very fabric of modern society, thread by painful thread. It would demand admitting that our workplaces are often fundamentally inhumane, our technologies deliberately addictive by corporate design, our cities constructed without consideration for psychological well-being, and our relentless pace of life, a calculated betrayal of our biological needs. Anxiety spreads not like a virus, but like awareness, a collective awakening to unbearable contradictions. The deepest terror may be this revelation, that we are not malfunctioning, but adapting all too well, that our anxious minds are not broken, but accurately perceiving an unbearable truth, that something is profoundly, systemically wrong with how we've constructed our world, and our anxiety is the ancient voice of warning, the primordial siren that once saved our ancestors, now roaring louder than ever before, through racing hearts and midnight panic. Yet still, we desperately drown it out with distractions, medications, and rationalization, hoping that silence will eventually come with the right combination of coping mechanisms. But that silence never arrives. Because you cannot permanently mute a warning system that evolved over millions of years to keep you alive. You can only choose to truly listen to what it's telling you about your environment, your choices, your society, or be gradually consumed by the growing roar of a mind trying desperately to survive in a world it was never evolutionarily equipped to navigate, let alone thrive within. And so we return to the question no modern therapy alone can answer. Are humans truly doomed to live in an age where anxiety is not the exception but the rule, a permanent state rather than a passing storm? Or does our awareness of this crisis signal the beginning of something more profound, a collective awakening demanding transformation? Across the world, small yet persistent revolutions are taking root, movements challenging our manufactured madness. Communities are redefining success, not by productivity metrics, but by the quality of presence, depth of relationships, and richness of inner life. Schools are slowly reimagining education to prioritize emotional literacy and psychological resilience alongside academic achievement. Visionary architects are designing spaces that restore our severed connection with natural rhythms, inviting sunlight, greenery, and the healing power of open skies into our daily existence. Tech ethicists fight for human attention to be treated not as a commodity, but as a sacred resource. These are not utopian dreams, but necessary adaptations for survival. For if anxiety is the desperate scream of a body and soul violently misaligned with its environment, then perhaps the path forward requires not better suppression techniques but a radical translation of its message. We must listen to what our collective suffering is desperately trying to communicate before it loses its voice completely, before we forget how this ancient warning system once saved us from extinction. In truly hearing this message, we begin rewriting our story, not as a doomed species entrapped by its own creations, but as creatures still capable of evolution, not just technological but emotional, spiritual, and communal. A final hope flickers in the darkness of our modern condition, not to erase anxiety from the human experience, but to fundamentally transform how we live because of what it reveals. This may be our last chance to create a world where our ancient nervous systems can finally feel at home. So the history of anxiety is not a narrative of weakness, but rather a profound warning encoded in the deepest layers of our biological heritage, constantly alerting us to dangers both visible and invisible, including the unseen peril of a world fundamentally out of sync with our ancient neurological architecture. If we are to survive, not merely as individuals struggling through each anxious day, but as a species facing unprecedented psychological challenges, perhaps we must stop pathologizing our panic and begin interpreting it as communication from our deepest selves. Not every racing heart signals malfunction. Not every restless night represents disorder. Not every fear lacks foundation in truth. Sometimes, anxiety speaks as the clearest voice we have left, calling us back to the balance we desperately need, to the forgotten rhythms our bodies still crave, to the essential humanity we have unconsciously bartered away for the hollow promises of speed, convenience, and illusory control. Our collective future hinges not on whether we can eliminate anxiety, but whether we can summon the courage to truly listen to what it reveals about our world, our societies, and ourselves before the warning grows too loud to bear and too late to heed.